Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Purple Pill Philosophy has another treat for you. This is Heiser House Part 2. Heiser, how was your day?
It was busy because we're moving. That's probably all I need to say. Anyone who's moved will understand.
Uh, well, it's great to have you on, Dr. Heiser.
Yep, thanks for having me back.
And this interview is about your second book, your second magnum opus, Reversing Hermon.
Okay. If you want to refer to it like that, sure.
Uh, the central themes of it are the concepts of the second divine rebellion in Genesis 6, and further explored in the Book of Enoch and the New Testament references to that book found in Jude and 2nd Peter as part of Jesus' mission.
Hmm.
The Book of Enoch serves as an explanation to why just about every ancient culture worshipped the pantheon of deities and explains where they come from, but considering the details in the book and the literary genre, isn't Enoch like 98% fiction?
Well, there's fiction in Enoch for sure. You know, all of these texts are describing. I mean, Enoch's not making stuff up wholesale. I mean, there are details that it sort of makes up. Like the some of the way that like the sons of God or the Watchers, sort of the divisions among them, the terms used for them. Some of that is what's the right word?
That
Original, to them. But what's actually happening in Enoch is the the writers of. Are we going to be serenaded? is that the theme for Enoch? Okay. What's actually going on is the people who are writing or contributing to Enoch, and Enoch is you know, as a book is actually several books. But what they're doing is they're interpreting Old Testament data. They are doing exegesis. They are looking at their Old Testament and they are seeing data points in the Old Testament that are not connected in the Old Testament necessarily. A few of them are, but a lot of them aren't. But the data points necessarily live in the Old Testament. And so the writer of Enoch and some of these other Second Temple books are just asking simple questions like, how does all this stuff fit together? What does it mean? How can we understand these data points as a whole? And so they're trying to interpret, what they find there. Now, in the case of the Second Temple period, specifically the Enochian material, there's other stuff going on too, because the Dead Sea Scrolls, several scrolls like the Book of the Giants from Qumran is the best example, inform us that the writers there in that period had some direct knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian material that was actually the backdrop to Genesis 6:1 through 4 that we, of course, don't have. I mean, scholars know what it is, but honestly, it really hasn't been assembled in detail until since 2010. But the ancient, again, Second Temple Jewish writer had access to this material, and those writers could understand why Genesis 6:1 through 4, and we'll include verse 5 in here, why that stuff's even in the Hebrew Bible. And so they're taking the knowledge of that material, the backstory to Genesis 6, the early verses of Genesis 6, and they're taking the data of Genesis 6 and also the ensuing material about the giants and whatnot, and they are trying to put all that together into what looks to them like a coherent whole. And you say, well, what about the Greco-Roman material? Like Hesiod's Theogony, the Greek Titan story. Well, as major studies of that material will tell you, and one author is Burkett is sort of an expert on this. Bremer, Jan Bremer, M.L. West, another book. I mean, there are whole studies, whole scholarly books on how the Greek stories like the Titans actually come from. They are derivative from ancient Near Eastern, i.e., Mesopotamian material. So even that, isn't like whole cloth new. And so again, if you're living in the Second Temple period and you're a literate person, you're a scribe or a priest or a religious thinker, and you're aware of all this material, this is the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to take all these data points and mine them and put them together into a coherent whole and figure out what was the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible writer trying to accomplish. Why this story? What are they shooting at? What's the point? And of course, Peter and Jude are part of the Second Temple period, and so they're going to be familiar with this material, and some of it is going to inform what they write in the New Testament. So the point here that I'm trying to make is, the point here is that nobody's sitting on their butts in the Second Temple period asking themselves, hey, I want to get an A in creative writing. What can I make up? They're not doing that. They're interacting with a lot of material, and they are doing exegesis, and they are doing theology in the process of interacting with that material. Yes, they do have original things that come out of that exercise, but by and large, they are interacting with material that already exists.
All right, and you mentioned that one Japanese scholar who specializes in the subject. What's her face?
Yeah, Annette Yoshiko Reed she's an important scholar in Enochian Studies. She has a book on the reception, both in Judaism and Christianity, of Genesis 6:1 through 4, and the Enochian Watcher story. So she contributes regularly. She's a recognized name in the field of Enochian research. She's not the only one. Lawrence Stuckenbrook is another one. He is, sort of ranked as one of the experts in this material. Archie Wright, who I've had on my Naked Bible podcast, is another one. He's the guy who wrote the book, The Origin of Evil Spirits. It was actually his dissertation, then it got published. But there are a number of people who sort of focus on this material. The major cuneiform expert who focuses on this material is Amar Anus, and his is the work published in 2010 that went back in all the Mesopotamian flood story stuff specifically, not to look for comparisons between that material and the biblical flood, but specifically the first 5 verses, the whole Sons of God episode. And he came out with an article in 2010 called On the Origin of the Watchers, where he traces all this stuff back to the Mesopotamian story of the Apkallu. And that Mesopotamian backstory can account for every element of Genesis 6:1 through 5. But it's only been 2010 since anybody's really bothered to do that. So if you wrote a commentary on Genesis earlier than that, it by definition is out of date and obsolete on this matter. And so that's the disadvantage, to this discussion, because people will pull commentaries off their shelves. I don't see anything about this, the sons of God or the sons of Seth and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, not really. You're operating sort of with, without meaningful and significant data. So you need to go back to scholarship and get caught up, get up to date.
Yeah, Sons of Cain, all that mess.
That's sort of like appealing to a modern evolutionist with Darwin's original writings.
Yeah, really, because it's like people don't realize. I mean, I guess they realize it. I hope they realize it a little more in the sciences, as science changes all the time. Well, so does every area of scholarship. You don't have people get degrees in things and then, well, I got my degree, I guess there's nothing to do now. Somebody pay me to sit on my butt, and play solitaire. It's not the way it works. Every field, things come along that require reevaluation of the field, and that's what scholars do. It's what people in medicine do, and law, and everything else. It's just the way it is.
All right. What most people are curious about. Let's talk about the old gods. Ra, Zeus, Odin, Quetzalcoatl, Amaterasu, all of them. Are they real and now, or did they exist long ago?
Well, if you affirm a biblical worldview, okay, let's just start there. You're dealing with 3 rebellions. They are both supernatural and human rebellions within the span of Genesis 1 through 11. You have the first one, which is the Satan figure, the original arch enemy. He's the original rebel. Then you have the sons of God in Genesis 6. And the Nephilim become part of this because they are the product of that. And then their disembodied spirits are what become known as demons in Second Temple literature. You also get hints of that in the Old Testament. And then the third group are the sons of God assigned to the nations who become corrupt and sow chaos in the nations and so on and so forth. So these are different entities, they're different groups. So to try to map them over to some other complex, sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's not. You know, with national gods, okay, and just, you know, some that that's probably going to be mappable to the third group, the gods over the nations. And if you affirm a biblical worldview, you believe these gods exist. I mean, this is what Scripture teaches. But it doesn't mean that you know, they get assigned names by every culture. You know, every culture has a sun deity. You know, in Egypt, it's Ra. It's like mostly Ra, but the sun disk is a different deity, the Aten. You know, they will name. They will give names to deities they believe are behind natural forces. The Old Testament actually demythologizes natural forces and puts them under the command of Yahweh, a lone deity. But typically, that's not the way it works. You know, every natural phenomenon has a distinct deity. There are deities who are allotted to specific countries and specific regions and specific towns. So, I mean, that much you get in the Old Testament worldview that maps over fairly nicely, you know, to some of these others. But they get their names because of attributes they are perceived to have, geographic regions they are supposed to govern. I mean, there are a number of reasons why a supernatural figure that a given culture believes is real is going to get the name and the description and the epithets that it does. So that can actually vary. You don't necessarily have neat, map ups. Now, in the ancient world, when one culture would go to war against another and conquer them, they could decide, well, we're either going to dump those gods or we're going to identify those deities as this particular deity, or our deities over here. And so they would map them over, and you get compound names, and you get, sort of a kind of an accumulation. One set subsumes another, which complicates things. But generally, if you're talking about national deities, that's going to be the third set in biblical thought.
The way I always understood the gods is in three categories, like personifications of nature, mythologized heroes and deified kings, and fallen angels as pop culture knows them by. Like, what are they really?
Yeah, I mean, you get, they're spirit beings. Again, in a biblical worldview, these are spirit beings. They are intelligent entities, if we can use that term. I don't. It's kind of difficult. We have to use terms like this that aren't perfect, but they're serviceable.
Yeah, like are some of them active spirit forces and others being half-human Nephilim offspring of the Watchers that once ruled over their nations?
You get all those categories. Now, the Watchers, the offenders of Genesis 6, they're never said to rule over nations. All of the ancient traditions, including the Mesopotamian traditions and the Greek traditions, have them being sent, being judged, punished by higher authorities, either the singular God of Israel or some other higher up deities from another pantheon. But the ones who cohabit with human women are sent to the abyss, the Abzu, Tartarus. I mean, the names vary, but they're sent to the underworld, and that's where they live. That's where they're imprisoned until the time of the end or some apocalyptic scenario.
Right.
So they're never said to govern nations, but their offspring, again, is where you get the demon idea, and they can come and go, but their fathers, so to speak, cannot. The ones who are over nations, that's a different group. So in biblical terminology, the principalities and powers are not demons. Demons are something different, and they're actually lower status. But we as moderns, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we tend to smash all these things together and use the white hats are angels, the black hats are demons. And that's too simplistic for the biblical text, but that's just the way people are used to talking about them.
We might talk about demons in our next talk on your book, Angels.
Yeah. I mean, demons are. It's interesting to people just to hear. Well, they're not the principalities and powers. It's something different. So
Right.
yeah, we can get to that at some point.
Relating to this question in Greco-Roman, Hurrian, and Hindu mythologies, we see this recurring cultural memory of gods battling and overthrowing the previous generation of gods that we know as the Titans or Asuras. Like
Yeah.
they would be the Watchers, correct?
Yeah. That's going to be there's some sort of rebellion against higher authority. Okay, that Sons of God, Watchers, and then the groups you just named. That has to be put down.
Although they do appear to live side by side in Egyptian and Norse mythology, with the giant serving the antagonistic role in the latter.
Yeah. It's not uniform, by any means. But like in Mesopotamia, this is viewed positively, because the Apkallu, the ones who before the flood, they're described as 100%, divine. After the flood, they are, quote, of human descent. So that group before the flood gets credit for assisting the people of Mesopotamia with civilization. They are called culture heroes for that reason. They're the great civilizers, and so they rebel against the decision of the higher gods to destroy humanity in a flood. In the Mesopotamian story, humans are noisy, they're not doing their job, let's get rid of them. And the Apkallu are like, well, good grief, we put a lot of work into these people.
So landlord.
They're not in favor of this, and so there's a rebellion. And to preserve their knowledge, they do that by again having this hybrid relationship with humans. And on the other side of the flood, that's why the Apkallu are referred to as being of human descent. And they also are giants. Gilgamesh is one of them. He is Lord of the Apkallu, and described as a giant in at least one text from Ugarit about this whole episode. So there you have kind of a side-by-side, relationship, or a positive one, because the Mesopotamians are like, these are good guys because they preserved our civilization for us. Those of us who survived this flood, we're glad that they did this. But the higher gods, of course, are not glad, and they send the Apkallu to the abyss. But the biblical version is quite different. This is not good, because what these guys teach humanity: arts of warfare, arts of seduction, pharmacopoeia, drugs, that get used in not necessarily necromancy, but you get the idea, just potions and whatnot, to produce altered states, astrology, idolatry. These are all things that the biblical tradition and the subsequent Second Temple tradition views as terribly negative, because they're self-destructive, they lead to human destruction, and they turn people away from Yahweh, the Most High. So that it's quite a different perspective.
And part
of
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, that goes like into the talk about magic, and I had all brought up during the Exodus, and so much how the Moses, was able to like basically overpower the magicians of Egypt or whatever with their snakes.
Go ahead.
I was wondering how that worked, like the distinction between a magic and a miracle.
Yeah, it seems. I mean, if you remember the Exodus narrative, they don't really get too far in miming what Moses and God is doing through Moses. And then the priests actually tell Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Like we're tapped at this point. So when it comes to the manipulation of the natural order, they run up against just things they can't do, and scholars have they've gone back into Egyptian texts, and they've wondered, well, how were the Egyptians able to do this? First of all, they don't reverse the water turning to blood. They make the problem worse. They imitate it. And then with the snakes, and they've come up with some kind of naturalistic means or magical means, again, sleight of hand kind of means that Egyptians, based on their textual material, could have used, that could be in view, in this story in Exodus. But again, once what Moses is doing starts either reversing or producing chaos out of the natural order of things, the way nature's supposed to work. They can't do that. So that I think helps answer the question, that where the line is. There's mimicking, and then there's actual control over nature. Those are two different things. So there's sleight of hand versus, wow, this person actually has command over nature, like the cycles of life and so on and so forth.
Part of the theme of your book is that the so-called Titans were the ones cast into Sheol, and part of Jesus' mission, which was to judge them after he died on the cross and before he rose from the dead, right?
Yeah, when it comes to the second group, again, the sons of God, the Watchers, again, the number 2 rebellion. If we understand the effect of that, I mean, there's basically 2 effects, and one plays out in the Old Testament for the most part, and the other one plays out for the most part. Well, maybe equal parts. Maybe we can be fair.
Was it just them while the other gods remain active, or what's really going on?
Yeah, the middle group are responsible for 2 things. They raise up a competitive seed. Essentially, they produce their own imagers to imitate what happens in Genesis 1, and of course the raising up of Israel from Abraham supernaturally. So they become earthly lethal threats, the Nephilim and the giant clans. Now, according to the Old Testament, that whole issue dies out during the time of David. The last of those remnants are dealt with. But the second trajectory is actually the one that's more important, that doesn't get noticed. And that is how this contributes to the proliferation of human depravity. For your listeners, they might get the importance of this by asking a question. How in the world do we go from Genesis 6:1 through 4, which is the weird sons of God story and the Nephilim and all that, to verse 5, which says, and God saw, that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's this statement of depravity. So how do we get from sons of God and human women, being sort of victims or whatever, to depravity? Well, the answer is the backstory, the Mesopotamian backstory, which is the Apkallu teaching humans certain knowledge that they were not meant to have, and that results in this corruptive effect. Now, the writer of Genesis assumes that you know that backstory. We don't. They did, because they're living closer to the time period.
So the role of the Apkallu Nephilim was that of Prometheus.
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of thing you get, and you can see the connection point, into the Greek world, the Greek version of all this, and that's the easiest one to see. But in terms of what the Messiah is supposed to do, the Messiah is supposed to fix all 3 rebellions. The first one results in the loss of immortality, and you get death and estrangement from God. So the Messiah is supposed to fix that. Well, he does through the resurrection, through the sacrificial atonement of himself. Okay, so that's the means we are brought to God, and we're going to rise again because we're part of the body of Christ as believers. So those problems are solved by the work of the cross. The second set, again, the bloodlines, the Nephilim stuff, those guys die out, not coincidentally. Think about this. Who are the ones in the Old Testament that kill them off? In biblical material, it's Moses, Joshua, and David. All 3 of those are types. It's typology. They are foreshadowings of the Messiah. That's not a coincidence. So in the Old Testament, the one trajectory is taken care of, but then we have to deal with human depravity. Well, how does the work of Christ address depravity? Again, if you know about the resurrection and the ascension, those 2 things are crucial and necessary to the coming of the Spirit who inhabits believers, who helps them resist depravity, and kickstarts the process of sanctification for the believer. Okay, so that's how it works there. The third group, the principalities and powers, again, what the nations that are disinherited at Babel, they're assigned to these lesser, sons of God, lesser Elohim. Well, they rule the nations. So how does the Messiah fix that? That might be the most obvious one, because you see it at Pentecost. Okay, the scattered Israelites are drawn to Pentecost. They hear about the Messiah. They believe. They're empowered by the Holy Spirit. They go back home to the nations among whom they're scattered, and they begin to evangelize. And eventually we get a guy named Paul called out specifically to take the gospel to the nations and bring them back. This is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, because right after the nations are disinherited and put under the other gods, God makes a covenant with Abraham that he includes the nations in. Abraham, you and your wife are perfect because you can't have children. She can't have a child. She's too old. That's perfect. It's ideal because I'm going to do this myself. And so that the result of this, the Israelites, they will know that the whole reason they exist is because I'm kickstarting, a human family for myself, and I'm doing it supernaturally. They can take no credit for this. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to make a covenant with Abraham and his offspring that they're supposed to be a kingdom of priests. That's what Exodus calls them, and a holy nation, so that, they can draw the nations back to the true God. Because in Genesis 3, that through you and your seed, all of these nations will be blessed. So the Messiah is the ultimate fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. We know that because of Galatians 3. That's what Paul says. If you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed and heir according to the promise, regardless of what you are ethnically. The people who are the real children of Abraham are those who believe and embrace the Messiah, who is the seed that would come from Abraham to reverse all of this stuff. So the Messiah he is the solution to all three of those things. So the middle group, the sons of God, they're in prison. I personally think, and you guys know because you've read Reversing Hermon, I think Revelation 9 is actually the prophecy of their release to, again, sow chaos before the day of the Lord, before the end of days. So I think that's what's going on there. They'll be, the finality of their judgment will happen, in the eschaton. But in the meantime, the Genesis 6 curse is being reversed through the Holy Spirit, who is but isn't Jesus. The 3 times Paul refers to Jesus as the Holy Spirit. It doesn't mean there's no Trinity. It just means the Lord is the Spirit, just as Jesus was God, but he's not the Father. So the Spirit is Jesus, but he's also not Jesus. He's also something different. This is actually where Trinitarian thinking comes from, this overlap between these three. But we're getting a little far afield now. But that's how the reversal of Genesis 6 again is working post crucifixion, post resurrection.
And the gods of the nations are still active, or are they?
Oh yeah. I mean, again, Paul, half a dozen times when he talks about the resurrection, he connects the resurrection to the defeat or the nullification, or his word is the stripping away of the authority of the rulers and the principalities and the thrones. He uses this language. And so what is he talking about? It just sounds kind of weird. Well, what he's getting at is that, look, these entities were given their authority by the Most High back at Babel in judgment. It was a judgment on the nations. And God, because the people who live in these nations, they're still people. They're still created in the image of God. God still is interested in them. He wants them ruled justly and properly according to his good character. But that's not what happens. We know that from Psalm 82, because why is God angry at this bunch? He's angry at them because they enslave their populations. They sow chaos among the nations. And of course, Deuteronomy 32:17 and a few other places in Deuteronomy 32, they're turning the hearts of the Israelites away from Yahweh to worship them. So the whole thing just sort of, goes to hell in a handbasket, pretty quickly. And we have this situation where we've got these lesser authorities who were given their authority by God, who have now turned adversarial. So what happens at the resurrection of Christ? Why is Paul associating that event with the nullification of their authority to rule the nations? It's actually pretty simple. When you think about it, Paul could go into a Gentile town and he says, look, I know what you guys are thinking, because this worldview, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of the Hebrew Bible, is in your own writers. It's in Plato. It's in a bunch of Greco-Roman texts, that the gods allot people to worship these gods, and there's a whole system of allotment going on. And so he looks at the Gentiles and says, look, I understand what you're thinking. You're afraid. You're afraid that if you leave the worship of your gods and turn to Jesus, okay, the Messiah, the God in the flesh that I'm preaching, that you're in trouble. You're afraid that this is going to put you in a real bind with your deities. I understand it, but here's something you need to think about. Those deities that that you believe you're allotted to, and you are, were put in their position by the Most High. And the Most High just became a man and died on a cross for you and rose from the dead and has now ascended back to heaven. And he is the one who gave them their authority, has now taken it away. Because at the resurrection and the ascension, here's Matthew 28:18. This is the first verse of the Great Commission. All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. Okay, this whole idea of inheriting the nations that the resurrected Christ gets associated with. Paul would say, look, you do not have to be afraid. The Most High, the one who is superior to all these gods, he is saying, you can come back home now. And not only can you, but I want you to return. Don't be afraid of these gods because I am superior to them. Come back home. This is Paul's gospel to the Gentile nations. And it is a reversal of the whole Deuteronomy 32 Babel, event, the judgment.
Mm-hmm. What also seems to be a universal theme across separate cultures are giants, dragons, minotaurs, and hybrid animal creatures. Like, is there some truth to any of that? Like, are they spirits that appear to humans in that way and aren't physical beings that left any trace, or what's the deal on that?
A biological claim to me, and that's certainly a biological one. I'd like to have some sort of evidence for it. However, biological evidence. However, if we are going to assign these sorts of abilities to deities, okay, that they can do this or that, and by the way, I'm not a deity, so I don't know how it works or what their limitations are. It's not in my job description.
Well, according to some of your fans, you're sort of a deity.
Say that again.
I said, according to some of your fans, you're sort of like a deity.
Well, they just need a hobby, but I think that, we have to at least, hold out, the possibility that the gods could, the Elohim could appear in these forms, and that, gives rise to how they're talked about. I think that would at least be a possibility. I think the greater likelihood, though, is that, again, how deities are talked about is naturally derivative from the world that the writers themselves are part of, what they experience. I mean, just like we're forced to use the language of latitude and longitude, the language of spatial relationships, to describe a place like heaven or hell or the underworld or whatever, a place that doesn't have latitude and longitude. You can't plot it out. We nevertheless, as embodied beings, have to use that kind of language to describe these places. Well, the same goes for how disembodied beings would get described. It's very normal to expect that we would describe them based on things that we do experience, like animals. Okay, this is why the gods live in gardens and mountains and the seas. Why? Because people don't live there. So this is a way of expressing the otherness of the gods, and the fact that humans cannot inhabit where they inhabit unless they're somehow supernaturally bidden or put there and protected from what would ordinarily kill them. So it's very normal, again, being in this situation where we're trying to describe the otherworldly place or otherworldly beings, that we have to use the vocabulary at our disposal. We don't have words for things that we don't or things that aren't part of our world. We we have to use what we have to express and describe those other things. So I think by and large, that's probably what's going on.
The namesake of reversing Hermon is the mountain where the Watchers landed, right? Or is that just what?
No, that's the
What the
case.
Jews? Hmm?
That's the case. Hermon, and Hermon has a long history. It's
Right,
not just
right. Is that just what the Jews thought? And if it did happen, when do you suppose it did happen?
no, it's not just what the Jews thought. I mean, again, the Jews are parsing older material, but very negatively. There's a really good article. I don't know if it's accessible just generally on the internet, but it's an article by Edward Lipinski, and it's called El's Abode. And what it is, it's a history of this mountain. All the way back into Sumerian literature, this place was considered to be the mountain of the gods, and specifically a garden mountain, a lush forested garden with plenty of water that happens to be on this mountain. So this goes all the way back to Mesopotamian tradition. And of course, if you're doing that, then you look for Gilgamesh. Yep, you can find material where Gilgamesh is associated with this place, and the Apkallu, and all this kind of stuff, the flood traditions. So they're not, again, the Second Temple writers aren't sitting around saying, man, we got to put the gods on a mountain. Do we have any good candidates? Let's look around. Oh, I like that one over there. No, I mean, yeah, that's the tallest peak that, is identifiable to the naked eye if you're living in that part of the world. That's true. But it actually has a long history that is viewed very negatively by Jewish writers.
And when do you suppose it happened?
Well, I mean, all of this is set before the flood. I don't know if I could put a chronology on the flood. I don't know how we would do that. I'm one who believes, for instance, that the genealogies are selective, and they do. You can't just string them together and come up with dates. That there are gaps, in the genealogies. They're selective for different reasons, various reasons. So I have no idea. I think, you got a flood. It is associated with human civilization. So if we're that's probably a better rule of thumb. When is the earliest evidence of human civilization?
6,000 years ago.
Yeah, something like that. So you have writing by 3,000, but you have urbanism, before that. And part of it is, well, how do we define civilization? Again, I don't think writing is a necessary component, although it's certainly important. Yeah. But things like, a settled civilization, the building of cities, settled agriculture, settled domestication of animals, that's civilization. So yeah, you can push it back to that. So it would be in conjunction, with that. Somewhere in the neighborhood there, you could give it a number as far as flooding. If you go with flood models, it depends too. Most people reject a global flood,
Yeah,
in favor of a local or a regional one. And there, a lot of those science folks who study a regional event would push it back even further, a few thousand years further. They times 5 to 10,000 or something like that. So, that's about the best you can do.
Also, when do you suppose the events of the Tower of Babel occurred?
Yeah, that's a more interesting question.
I myself always thought of Babel as a compression of loosely connected events, such as the rule of Gilgamesh, the building of the earliest ziggurats, the Akkadian Empire, and that reflected things about the Babylonian exile.
What's really interesting is you have to know a little something about Amorite traditions here, because if you're looking at Canaan, the population of Canaan before the Israelites get there is really from three groups. One is a group called the Amorites. Another group comes from the Hurrians or the Hittites, Anatolia, regions in the north there. And then the third group are the Sea peoples, from the Aegean. So all of those traditions, I mean, this is kind of an interesting question, because the Amorites swept through what would be Canaan and Babel and Mesopotamia, 2,500, 2000 BC. By 2000 BC, Mesopotamia is Amorite. Hammurabi is an Amorite king. He's not native Mesopotamian. He's an Amorite. And so this is the period when you get, these ziggurats and whatnot. But the reason I'm bringing this up is if
that's
you look at
that's the Neo-Sumerian Amorites, right?
yeah, and there's a big discussion over who gets, where do the Amorites come from? Typically it's like Syria, the northern area. They sweep through, and again, and what we think of as Sumerian Mesopotamian culture, it's actually a lot of those people that come in. Now they get driven out by the Hittites and the Hurrians, but the Hittites and the Hurrians don't occupy. They leave, for geopolitical reasons of their own. But when Nebuchadnezzar comes around, when you have the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he wants to link himself and his empire with the Amorite traditions. And so a lot of scholars view the Tower of Babel as the tower that Nebuchadnezzar had repaired as part of this Amorite glorification process. Now, that would be too long, because Ezra's is in the early, late, or I always get my chronology mixed up, early 600s, late 500s BC. But Andrew George, who did the latest critical edition of like the Gilgamesh epic, and he's put a lot of time into this Babel stuff. He has come up with textual references to that tower that go all the way back to that earlier period. So when you said you think that the Babel traditions really do dip into the early stuff, I would agree based upon what George is saying. I don't think you can just peg this at Nebuchadnezzar's Amorite campaign. I do think that there is evidence, textual evidence, to pinpoint, a tower in this place very, very long ago, in these early periods.
And which ziggurat in particular would that be? The earliest one?
Oh, and I think it's Enmeteronki is the one that is sort of the favored candidate for this. Again, and it has a long history. So
yeah, but isn't that like too late?
Well, it is if you're excluding the early textual material that talks about a tower being built on that location. So in other words, there isn't just one tower and one building campaign. There is an earlier tower that is the basis for the later stuff, which is why I think Andrew George's work is kind of important. If you Google Andrew George and Tower and Babel, you're going to come across the textual references that form the basis of his argument. It's actually fairly recent stuff, because George has put a lot of time into this particular issue after he moved on from his critical edition of Gilgamesh. So for your listeners, I would recommend Googling that to get the specific textual references. So, Nebuchadnezzar, now think about this, that both periods actually, the earlier tower and then what Nebuchadnezzar's doing with Enmeteronki is actually, both of them are actually important, because again, this is just me now. I'm not saying anybody has to adopt this position. But I believe that Genesis 1 through 11 was either composed during the Babylonian exile or heavily edited. I'm willing to think parts of it could have existed earlier and then got edited, because there's so much, not only Babylonian polemic in those 11 chapters, but lots of stuff that get directly traced to Marduk, who's the main deity figure, during the period of Nebuchadnezzar. Earlier he's a minor figure. Later he becomes the major, figure. But for that reason, I think we're wise to pay attention to both traditions, the Nebuchadnezzar, the Neo-Babylonian stuff, and also the older stuff, when we are thinking about Babel as far as an event and what it meant.
And which this ties into it, because Nebuchadnezzar compares himself, Lucifer is compared to Nebuchadnezzar, but in Isaiah 14. But we'll be discussing Lucifer in our next talk about your book Angels. But he, or rather the Nakash, who we know as Lucifer, was the first divine rebel, like however many eons ago that was.
Yeah.
After the Watchers rebelled as well in Genesis 6, why did God trust the other sons of God when dividing the nations for himself, knowing they would betray him later
Yeah,
on?
yeah, that's kind of like, why does he trust us? God has committed himself to having children, creating both humans, embodied children, we call them humans, as his imagers, and before humans, disembodied, lesser versions, disembodied creations who are created as his imagers. In other words, his representatives in the spiritual world. Humans are God's representatives in the embodied world. So when he does that, he shares his attributes with them so that they can indeed image him, represent him. And so once God has decided to do that, one of God's attributes is freedom. This is where we get, free will. You know, God isn't going to go back on it. He's not going to say, boy, I had a brain fart that day. That was a terrible idea. An omniscient being can't say things like that and wouldn't. So God is committed to this path, and he is big enough, he is superior to all of his creations, including these two groups, the heavenly imagers and the earthly imagers, that he doesn't need to strip away their freedom to further his plan and basically to have his way, to restore what was lost in all of these rebellions. So the fact that he is committed to this, again, having both supernatural and human families and partners with him to do things. Again, God doesn't need any of it. He doesn't need them. He doesn't need us, but he has chosen to do this because, personal reflection. I think God just enjoys and acts upon his creative impulse. It's part of who he is. And so once he's committed to this, yeah, this is who he's dealing with. He's dealing with us and our screw ups, and he's dealing with them. This is why Job says, several times, at least 3 times, we get this line that God doesn't trust his holy ones. Why doesn't he trust them? What does that mean? It doesn't mean that every member of the heavenly host is just a ticking time bomb waiting to fly off the handle in rebellion. It certainly means that the potential to rebel is there, but it also means that they're imperfect. He doesn't trust them. Why? Because they're not him. Only he has a perfect nature, and God knows this. So he knows what he's dealing with. He knows when he looks at us, he knows what he's dealing with. He remembers that we are dust, as the psalmist says. But nevertheless, he enjoys doing things this way. He loves us. And so he's willing to work the plan without eliminating us, without either turning us into robots or turning the heavenly host into robots, or just wiping the table clean and saying, who's going to know? This is actually at the heart of Job. The first 2 chapters of Job, with Job's suffering. The Satan there, Hasatan, is not the devil. Again, Unseen Realm might talk about this.
Yeah.
But he's doing his job. He's running around looking to and fro on the earth and seeing who is faithful.
The black sheep of the divine council.
Right. And he becomes the black sheep not because he's the devil, but he becomes the black sheep because he challenges God's assessment of Job. So that is both a challenge to God's omniscience and a challenge to God's integrity. Is God telling the truth? Does God know? So he challenged. What was that?
It's like an honor challenge, which was a big deal back in ancient.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, because I remember, if you challenged the king's honor, that would be taken as treason.
Yep. Yep. So we have a problem, and this is why God tells him. He says, "Okay," this is Mike's paraphrase. "Okay, you don't think I either know or that I'm telling the truth." Now, I could just, have you guys ever seen Time Bandits, the movie?
Yeah, I like.
Okay.
I like Bill and Ted better, but yeah.
Okay, but you have the evil one. When he looks at his underlings and they challenge him, he's like, "Don't ever talk to me like that again." Then he blows them up. Well, if God does that to Hasatan, guess what? The question he raised is still on the table. Everybody else knows that God just eliminated the challenger. He didn't answer the question. So he can't do that. So what he tells the challenger, the Satan, the adversary, is, okay, I will let you do everything to Job short of taking his life. And the reason why God says it that way is because he doesn't want the Satan, Hasatan, to come back and say, oh yeah, Job would have buckled if you would have let me do this. No, you can do whatever you want to him, except kill him, because we need him alive so that he can endure and validate my assessment of him. So go ahead. We're going to find out who's right. And we're all going to learn a lesson here, especially you. Okay. And Job isn't aware of any of this, so he's wondering through the whole book, like, why am I suffering? And because God was correct, and in the end, we know how the story ends. God validates him and restores. So that's really it. All of this is at the heart of that story. Again, we're not dealing with the devil there, but we are dealing with an uppity member of the divine council who crosses a line and needs to be dealt with.
Also, at what point did the betrayal of the sons of God take place? The later sons of God, the Olympians, Norse gods, Egyptian gods, all of them.
Yeah, the things, the ones that derive out of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. We're not given a chronology, but I suspect it was pretty soon because of Genesis 11. Because by the time we do get to Abraham, we're not necessarily given a complete chronology, but I mean, if you actually figure it out, it's like a century or a little less if you actually plug the numbers of the patriarchs into this issue. Because Abraham's parents, his father is a pagan. He's a polytheist. He's an idolater. And so that in biblical thought is a situation that derives from Babel. So it has to be reasonably close. So I would say, a century after Babel, we've got this problem. As far as the distance between Babel and the flood, again, that's something that's variable. That, again, I'm one who thinks that the genealogies, have gaps in them. Personally, I think there's a mathematical cipher to be found there, but nobody's come up with anything that's completely satisfactory. There have been some good attempts, but I suspect because of the Sumerian king list, there is a mathematical cipher for that. And the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 10 track on the Sumerian king list a lot. So that's my suspicion anyway.
There's so much we could talk about the first 11 chapters of Genesis alone.
Oh, I know.
We're running out of time.
That's a lifetime. Yeah, I got to run because we have
there seems to be a rise in neo-paganism or heathen religionists, as they like to call themselves in the last 10 years especially. But would you take this to mean that the old gods are making a comeback of sorts, or is it more comparable to a similar rise in New Age stuff?
Well, I do think, I'm not one who's really, I'm not married to any eschatological system, so I can't sit here and say, oh, absolutely, we're living in the last days and they know it, because Paul linked their final defeat to the fullness of the Gentiles. The reclaiming of the nations. And whenever God says that stuff, that's going to reawaken Israel. This is Romans 9 through 11. I get all that. Only God knows when these things, in terms of timing, are going to happen. So we could be living in the last days. I don't know. But I'm not gonna like camp on a particular position of eschatology and say that's the reason. I think it could be an element. That's about the most I'll say there. But in addition to that, I do think that supernatural intelligences who hate humanity and want to be at the forefront of the demise of humanity, they understand that in every person there is a hunger for the transcendent, for a transcendent reality, and there is a hunger for mystery. And the current mechanistic, materialistic, atheist view that says the only thing that is real is what you can detect with your five senses, that is unsatisfactory to most of the population of the world. And I think they know that. I think they understand that these impulses are within humans and they're not being satisfied by atheism. And they're also, sadly, often not being satisfied by Christianity, by Judeo-Christianity. I think Christians need to own that, because they make the Bible so boring and want to deny, the spiritual reality that Scripture presents. And so I think a lot of people are just ripe for the picking, for exposure to these things, and they're going to pursue. They're going to pursue spirituality to fill these voids in their hearts, and that's why I think more than anything, we see the rise in this. It's a failure, of what ought to be the truth being put out there in its fullness, and instead denying, most of the supernatural worldview that the Bible actually presents us, and that creates a wedge of opportunity for supernatural beings, the ones in Scripture anyway.
Okay, one last question. The context behind the reversing Hermon is the references in Jude and 2 Peter. Like, does it bear any truth on the matter if they weren't written by Jude or Peter, respectively?
Well, I don't reject Petrine, or what's the right adjective for Jude? Judean authorship.
Jesus' brother.
Yeah, I don't know what the right adjective is there to take that proper noun and turn it into an adjective. Petrine is usually
Jesus' brother.
Yeah. Yes, I don't. I mean, there are arguments that they didn't write the stuff, but I still think they did. But at the end of the day, no, it really doesn't matter. Because we have biblical books named after biblical figures, and we have no idea who wrote them. 1st and 2nd Samuel, they never claimed to be written by Samuel. I mean, we have no idea who wrote them. Job, we don't know who wrote that.
And there's a whole can of worms of Daniel.
Yeah. We just don't know. Joshua, I mean, there's nothing that says that he wrote the book. So there's a whole bunch of those things. So no, I don't think that is much of an issue at all. Even though I'm still in the camp that I don't see a compelling reason why these couldn't be written by the people who bear their names. Scholars still argue about that. You still have scholars that take both sides of that. Either side, I should say.
All right, this is passing our hour mark. Any last thoughts?
Nope, just thanks for having me. And if your listeners want to find out more, they should go to drmsh.com, drmsh.com. You can pretty much find anything I'm into through my homepage. And of course, books available on Amazon. So just thanks for having me.
You, Brett?
Yeah, nice. It was nice having you on. It was interesting hearing about all this theology and some of the history that went on. I learned a lot of things from this, so it was very eventful. Glad to have had you on, Dr. Heiser.
Good. I'm glad it wasn't dry and toasty.
It might be. Well, we might make Angel's interview dry and toasty.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the good guys are dry and toasty. Yeah.
We'll talk about demons also.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, you guys.
Welcome.
Yeah.
See you next time.
Yep. Bye-bye.